What am I going to get out of this if I go through the pain that grief is associated with? Because it is a form of suffering. And as Christians, we believe that the Spirit of God is in the midst of that suffering and is going to take that grief and use it in a way in which we will be able to grow. And that's why we call it a gift, even though it's unwanted.
Hey, I'm Brian, Pastor Brian here at Christ Church, and I want to welcome you to our recovery podcast today. And we're going to talk about a subject that, and we're recording this right smack dab in the middle of the Christmas season and all the hustle and bustle that goes with that. But we're going to discuss a subject that comes up a lot, but actually also during this time of the year seems like it comes up more. And the topic is grief. And we're going to unpack a few things. We're going to unpack a book. And I brought somebody along with me today. And this is Dr. David Jenkins. I think we can actually throw Reverend Doctor in there if we wanted to. He's got the qualifications for that. But just tell us a little bit about you, David, and your experience and, what you did prior employment and what you bring to the table today with that.
Sure. So. Thank you. First of all, I'm honored to be here, and it's been an honor working with you over the last couple of years, and look forward to more of that. My basic background has been in the area of pastoral care. So I have spent many years working in the context of one of the major cancer hospitals, MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. I spent a number of years working with hospice, both in California as well as in other parts of Texas. And much of my work, my doctoral dissertation was around questions of grief, grieving, what are both the psychological and the spiritual or theological issues that human beings face whenever they have to face a loss. And oftentimes I started, especially with Christians, to remind them that Jesus himself in the book of Isaiah was described as one who was acquainted with grief. And he often spoke in terms of his own soul being troubled, which is another way of saying something deep within him was moving him to tears, literally to tears, grieving over Jerusalem, for example, because the people would not change their hearts and minds and move toward God. So my point there is to say it's a normal experience. If the Lord grieved, we can be expected to grieve. And I think that's the best place to start for people to realize that Jesus in his human fullness experienced grief, and so shall we.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you. You mentioned your experience in the hospitals and hospice. So you have seen all sides of grief over many, many years of sitting with people at, in most cases, the worst moments in their life. And then on the other side of that is they get up and they go home and they wake up the next day and then they're like, well, what am I feeling? What am I feeling? And that's kind of, what is grief? What is grief?
That's a great question. And believe it or not, grief is difficult to describe because it comes as a admixture of many, many different possibilities, many emotions. We can literally be laughing and crying at the same time as an experience of grief, for example. And I've seen this happen. People will tell a story about someone who has recently passed, and they'll be tearing up, and yet at the same moment, they'll tell a little funny story about that loved one. That's all a very healthy expression of grief, particularly with the loss of a loved one. But for most people, grief shows up in the experience of shock, the experience of surprise, if you will, that something has happened that was unexpected. A person dies suddenly, an accident occurs, a disaster happens, someone loses their job, someone cuts them short and a relationship is broken. Those are examples of losses that occur and cause us to have an emotional response and also a physical response, which is why grief is such a complicated area of our lives, because it impacts us bodily as well as emotionally as well as spiritually.
Yeah, cool. So grief, just to sum that up, I mean, grief is a normal emotional response to a significant loss. If you wanted to get technical.
Yes, and to add to that, to not experience grief as a result of a loss would be a non-normal response, because loss is going to include that aspect of grief, the emotional aspect.
Okay, and then there's and what we're doing here is we're kind of taking grief and pulling back the layers of it, just a 10,000 foot overview, just to paint a picture. But there are different types of loss.
Yes.
What are those?
Yes. As I mentioned, losses can occur in terms of relational loss. You can have a loss of a job. One of the things I experienced personally with growing old is a loss of bodily function. I can't think like I used to. I can't move around like I used to. Those are losses I have to come to grips with and recognize. The good news is I get to live a long life in this culture, but that also has challenges, and each of those challenges includes the possibility of a loss. So losses don't just have to do with people who have died or passed away or left. They can be anything. Even losing your keys is a form of loss, albeit nothing to the extent of the loss of a person's life. But every loss is best dealt with by first acknowledging it as a loss. To walk away and say, well, that wasn't really a big deal, that relationship really didn't mean that much. To minimize losses is to cut yourself off from the possibility of gaining the blessings, and I'm serious about this, the blessings of grief. That, as one of my colleagues wrote in one of his books, grief is the unwanted gift, because it makes us feel uncomfortable. We have to stop and put our lives on hold if we're going to deal with grief and acknowledge, first of all, I'm grieving, I'm hurting. There's something that I've lost or someone that I've lost. Something's happened in my life that has turned it upside down or has thrown it off kilter. And so acknowledgement must be the first step to take once we recognize that we're in grief. And usually shock, anger, fear are often the beginning signs of grief as it occurs.
Yeah. So that brings in, and most are familiar, or if you're not, but have heard of the 5 stages of grief. And the first one is actually denial, which is what you just hit. You've got to step out of that. The next would be anger. The next would be bargaining. That's what I like to call where the only ifs enter the picture.
Yes.
Only if this would have happened, and then you physically go into a depression, a physical response to it. And then the final stage is where you actually accept that it has happened.
Yes.
So, but one thing you hit just a minute ago, and everybody's talked about, grief death and loss of a loved one or something, but of those. But you mentioned like job loss and all the other stuff. So grief is just not tied to death. I mean, if you've worked the same job for 25 years and then they come in and say, hey,
Yes.
it's been great, but
Yes.
have a good day. You're no longer needed. And then you wake up that next morning, wait a minute, I'm not going to work today.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is all too often, I think, overlooked.
Yes.
Yes. That is actually grief you're experiencing.
My wife and I recently sold our home, the last home we'll ever own in this life, and we moved into a retirement home. And both of us have experienced grief from that movement. Even though we were looking forward to the move and we felt it was the right time, it has difficult aspects to it. We're giving up independence. There's things about a home that is full of memories, full of objects that have meaning, and then we have to give them up, at least physically, and move on to the next spot. So even a move from one location to another can bring about grief. And it's best to just say, okay, I'm experiencing it right now. What does this mean for me? Can I take the time out to acknowledge it, get past the denial? Maybe if I'm angry or fearful, admit that, and then ask the Lord, what does this mean, Lord?
And you mentioned the move, giving up independence, and that's huge. And
Yes.
the thing is, did that actually force you to slow down, or you're sitting here as the one that did a doctoral work on grief, and you're sitting there like, wait a minute, am I grieving? Is this because I'm?
Yes.
Is this happening to what all these people I've talked to about? And now I'm sitting here
That's
looking at myself in the mirror like, what's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. That's a great question. And that is actually one of the gifts of grief, that grief invites us to slow down. The culture doesn't want us to slow down. It's expecting us to stay in production mode. And it's very tempting to do that, because if we slow down, we're going to have to be honest about what's happened here and what impact is it having, what kind of feelings am I having. And the other aspect of that is it is not a private affair. Grief can happen to entire groups of people. Think about the losses and the grief that occurred when the Twin Towers fell. A whole culture was in grief. So in a sense, we have to give ourselves and we have to give each other permission to take time and stop and just reflect. Listen to ourselves, listen to what others might have to offer in terms of their heartfelt attempts to help us through that process. Some advice is good, some advice is not so good. If somebody says, oh, just get over it, that's not good advice. Yeah. If someone says, yeah, you need to take time, you might need to take a walk. You might need to go and do something you normally wouldn't do. See a movie. You might need to read a book. You might need to just stop and be alone. For many people, being alone is hard to do, believe it or not.
So you said grief invites us. I love this. Grief invites us in to take the opportunity to slow down. But when it invites us in and we take it up on its offer, there's going to be some emotions that come with that, isn't it?
Yeah.
And all too often they stack up, and the way the book, All Our Losses, All Our Grief, put it, is that they cluster together.
Yes.
And some of these, I'm gonna read these off, and then we'll talk just a minute. But some of these are really going to sound familiar. The first cluster would be numbness, emptiness, loneliness, and isolation,
Yes.
which is huge, isolation. The next cluster is fear and anxiety. And the next one is really huge, but guilt and shame go together. And then anger seems to stand alone. But the last one would be sadness and despair.
Yes. Yes.
Being invited into that, I don't know. They're not sounding real. They sound like, I don't know. I'm going to let you expand on that because.
Yeah. It is not easy to convince someone to take up that invitation until they trust the invitation and go ahead and do it. My own experience has been the more comfortable I become with my own grief, the more willingness I'm able to take up that invitation, say, okay, I've been in this place before. You know, I've lost loved ones, I've lost jobs, I've moved around. I know what it does to me. I trust the grief process, and that is so important until you've had the experience. That's why a lot of times when someone has grief, they don't even recognize it. Somebody else does. You know, my wife may see it in me and she may say, you know, David, you need to stop. You sound sad, or you look angry, or what's bugging you? And that's one form of the invitation. Somebody else says that. Or you may pick up the invitation in a book you're reading or a movie you're watching. Something touches a chord and all of a sudden you feel one of these clusters of emotions. And then it's up to you to say, okay, I heard that podcast. I know what they're talking about now. I'm going to stop. I'm just going to let it be for a minute and see what comes out of that. And my belief is if you're able to do that, the Lord will lead you to the next place in that process as well, because there is kind of a natural progression. It may be laid out in stages, and by the way, those stages don't necessarily happen in order. They simply describe the likely possibilities of what's going to happen.
Yeah. So I guess in the invitation, it's good to know that it's okay to feel these.
Yes.
But it's not okay to stay there and not acknowledge it. Right. You've got to take the next step, which is saying, okay, where the numbness, emptiness, loneliness, and isolation. And isolation is the huge one. That's where you pull completely away. Pull from everything. And in that, you could be experiencing all these other ones. But the danger is you've isolated.
That's right.
So you've got to shatter that isolation and take that next step.
And the isolation is not the only symptom of a person who is not facing grief. People often turn to drugs, people overeat, people get lost in their thoughts and their grief and can't do their jobs. The relationships get broken. So if the grief is not acknowledged, there's a downstream effect of that. Most of the time it shows up either psychologically, spiritually, or in some cases physical abuse of self and others.
And that's why we're mentioning that on a recovery podcast.
Yeah.
Because we see so much of grief in that whole process of recovery that is just really not been dealt with, not even acknowledged. And then when we start unpacking things, you're like, oh, wait a minute, you're actually hadn't dealt with the grief of this situation, which is causing this other stuff to stack up. And let's work this, and then we'll start unpacking this. And the break the isolation, and then honestly acknowledge that you're feeling some guilt and shame, but because of that, you're engaging in this behavior to keep that suppressed or keep
I
that
know
down?
often with males, speaking for myself, one of our habits is to get busy if we're dealing with a loss.
Oh,
To
neat.
get back to work, to avoid it, find a way to get busy and minimize. And again, it goes back to the question, well, what's the value of the invitation of the grief? What am I going to get out of this if I go through the pain that grief is associated with? Because it is a form of suffering. There is suffering going on in the process of grief. And as Christians, we believe that the Spirit of God is in the midst of that suffering and is going to take that grief and use it in a way in which we will be able to grow. And that's why we call it a gift, even though it's unwanted.
Yeah. So we've hit what grief is. We've hit some feelings associated with it. We've actually unpacked these emotional clusters a little bit, some of the stuff that we feel. What are some of the characteristics of grieving? What will we see if you're not familiar? Like, what characteristic? And I'll just read a few of these off. But what do I need to look for? And the first one is searching for the lost object. Self-oriented stuff. Time distortion. What would you be looking for to say, well, this may be grief? So.
Yeah. Well, one of the areas I would notice in a person or myself is the failure to be able to focus on things that I need to focus on, because somewhere in my mind, I'm still back there with the loss. If a person you love dies, you may be thinking of that person much of the time of the day, in one way or another, and that keeps you from being able to focus on what perhaps your job is or what you need to be paying attention to. So it throws our attention, our ability to be attentive to the moment off. And so that, to me, is a big symptom. And I already mentioned busyness. People often become so busy that they overwork and they become exhausted. And before you know it, they're in the doctor's office complaining of different mood swings, anxiety, exhaustion. Sleeplessness is a typical characteristic of grief that's not being addressed. Nightmares and dreams are another area that will show us unconsciously that there's something going on that we're not paying attention to. So along the clusters of emotions are clusters of behaviors that are all possibly going on. And the great irony is we are often the ones who are the least able and likely to notice. Somebody else notices it.
So
brings
if
it up.
you're having, so what you're telling me is you can have some physical issues
Oh, yeah.
as a result of not dealing with some grief or not processing or not accepting that invitation.
Yes.
But it's hard to see in the mirror, and it takes someone else to point it out. But if you're isolated all the time and you're hiding, going back to work all the time, as we men try to, just to stay busy,
Yes.
you'll never see it. So embrace the opportunity when someone says, hey, is there something not right? Or is there something, I know a while back you had this loss, and I hadn't heard you say much about it. Is that still something you're dealing with, or something you haven't? Let's go have a coffee type of thing. You fully embrace that moment.
If you notice, for example, someone who's not shown up at church for a long time and they were a regular attendee, I'll bet there could be something going on in the way of a loss that's just thrown them off. And they are now grappling with one of the key questions: how could God allow this to happen? How could this be a good thing in some way, and yet acknowledge that it's not such a good thing in another way? How can both be true?
That is an excellent place to stop for today, because our next our part two, we're actually gonna dive in to the goals of grieving and what to expect from grieving, but also things that hinder grieving. And I think that's just an excellent place to stop. So we're going to conclude this part one, and we just ask that you tune in for our part two, the next one of our grief podcast. But we're actually going to cover the goals of grieving. What can I get out of accepting that grief invitation? But also we're going to unpack what gets in the way of grieving, which I think is huge. And I think when if you take the time to listen and you hear these things, it's going to resonate with many people. So, David, thank you for joining me today, and we will get together for part two. And just a side note, we mentioned this at the beginning. Me and David, he helps me with one of our Celebrate Recovery nights, and David plays guitar, something he picked up, I guess, post retirement. But that's actually how we met, and had a guy up there playing guitar, and then we sat down and talked one day, and I realized that all of this was under the surface, and I thought it was just a fellow up there playing guitar. So take time to get to know folks and have a conversation. And David, thank you for being with us today, and we will get together for part two.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.